Friends, before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a broken down piece of land, something everyone else had given up on, and seen not what it was, but what it could become? That's exactly the kind of man Ethan Reeves was. And if you stay with me for the next 30 minutes, I promise you'll understand why this story, out of all the ones I've told you, is the one that still keeps me up at night thinking about it. It was the spring of 1885, in a dry, sun-bleached corner of Texas where the wind never seemed to stop talking. Ethan Reeves was 35 years old, and he had spent almost every one of those years working land that belonged to someone else. He had broken his back on other men's cattle, mended other men's fences, and slept in other men's bunkhouses, always saving, always waiting for the day he could finally call something, anything, his own. That day came when he heard about Silver Creek Ranch. Nobody wanted it. The barn roof had caved in on one side, the fences had rotted through in a dozen places, the well was dry more days than it ran. But Ethan didn't see ruin. He saw a foundation. He handed over every dollar he had saved in 15 years of hard labor, and he rode up that broken dirt road with nothing but a tired horse, a few tools, and a stubborn kind of hope that refuses to die in men who have nothing left to lose. Now I want you to imagine what it must have felt like, standing in front of that collapsing house for the first time. The porch steps groaned under his boots. Dust hung in the air like it had never once been disturbed, and yet Ethan Reeves smiled. Because for the first time in his whole life, whatever happened next, good or bad, would happen on land that belonged to him and no one else. He got to work immediately. There was no time to waste feeling sorry for himself. He chopped wood before sunrise. He hammered fence posts under a sun so brutal it could blister a man's neck in an hour. Every night, he collapsed onto a thin cot with hands raw and bleeding, and every morning, he got back up and did it all over again. Loneliness has a particular weight out on the open plains. Have you ever felt it? That silence that stretches for miles in every direction, broken only by wind and your own thoughts. The barn was the worst of it. Half the roof had fallen in years before he ever arrived, and the wood underneath had gone soft and grey with rot. Ethan spent the better part of 2 weeks tearing out rotten beams and hauling in fresh lumber from town, a little at a time, whatever he could afford after buying feed and nails and the handful of tools he still needed. He rebuilt that barn plank by plank, the same way I suppose a man rebuilds anything worth having, slowly, stubbornly, and mostly alone. At night, he'd sit on the porch steps with a tin plate of beans balanced on his knee, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills, and he'd let himself wonder, just for a minute, whether all this work would ever amount to anything more than a lonely man and a patch of dirt. But then morning would come and he'd get up anyway. That's the thing about people like Ethan Reeves. Hope isn't loud in them. It's quiet. It just refuses to quit. He knew, of course, about the Whitfield estate. Everyone in that county knew about the Whitfield estate. You could see it from the highest ridge on his property. White columns catching the morning light, more cattle grazing on that land than most men would see in a lifetime. Ethan never thought much about it beyond a passing glance. That world had nothing to do with his, or so he believed. But Ethan Reeves wasn't the only person living in that valley. Just a few miles away, across rolling golden hills, stood the Whitfield estate, a mansion so grand it looked like it belonged in a different world entirely. White columns, manicured gardens, more cattle than a man could count in a week. And living inside that mansion, sheltered from every hardship life could offer, was 25-year-old Charlotte Whitfield. Charlotte was, by every account, breathtaking. Deep red hair that caught fire in the sunlight, eyes the color of a clear summer sky, and a spirit that no amount of wealth had ever managed to tame. She had been raised with every comfort money could buy, and yet, underneath the fine dresses and the polished manners her father demanded, there beat a heart that longed for something real. something her father's fortune could never purchase. One afternoon, restless and craving freedom from the suffocating walls of the mansion, Charlotte saddled her white horse and rode out across the open plains faster than she probably should have. The wind pulled her red hair loose from its pins. For a few glorious minutes she felt free, and then, without warning, her horse's hoof caught a hidden gopher hole, and Charlotte was thrown hard into the tall grass at the edge of an unfamiliar property. Ethan heard it before he saw it, the panicked whinny of a horse, the thud of something hitting the ground. He dropped his tools without a second thought and ran. What he found in that grass stopped him cold. A young woman in a torn, dusty riding dress, dazed, struggling to sit up, blood trickling from a scrape on her wrist. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside her, his voice rough but gentle. Charlotte blinked up at him, and in that single moment, dust in the air, sun blazing overhead, a stranger's calloused hand steadying her shoulder, something shifted. She didn't know it yet, but her whole life was about to change. He helped her to her feet, walked her and her limping horse back to his humble ranch house, and there, in that small room with its cracked walls and simple furniture, he wrapped a clean cloth gently around her wrist. Charlotte watched him work with quiet fascination. She had been surrounded by servants her entire life, yet she had never once seen anyone tend to her with such careful, unhurried tenderness. "I'm Charlotte," she finally said. "Charlotte Whitfield." Ethan's hands paused for just a second. Everyone in the county knew that name. The richest rancher's daughter, sitting in his broken-down kitchen, letting him bandage her wrist like she was just another person in trouble. He didn't say much about it. He simply finished what he'd started and offered her a cup of coffee in a chipped tin mug. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. A storm was rolling in fast, the kind that turns the Texas plains into a battlefield of wind and rain within minutes. Ethan, without a hint of pretense, told her plainly that she wasn't riding home in that. Charlotte, who had never once in her life been told what to do by anyone below her station, found herself agreeing without a single word of protest. They sat together by the small stone fireplace as rain hammered the roof and thunder rattled the windows. And in that firelight, something remarkable happened. Two people from completely different worlds simply talked. No performance, no pretense. Charlotte asked him why he'd bought such a broken-down ranch when he could have chosen somewhere easier. Ethan looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because it's mine," he said simply. "First thing in my whole life that's ever been mine." There was something in the honesty of that sentence that cracked something open in Charlotte's chest. She had grown up with everything, and yet she had never once heard anyone speak about ownership, about identity, with that kind of raw, earned pride. She fell asleep sitting upright near the fire that night, and Ethan, without a word, laid his own worn blanket gently over her shoulders and watched her sleep with an expression he didn't quite understand himself yet. By morning, a Whitfield carriage had come looking for her. Charlotte climbed inside, glancing back once at the humble man standing on the porch of his humble ranch. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. But as the carriage disappeared over the hill, Ethan found a small cloth she'd left behind, still carrying the faint trace of her perfume. And for the first time in 15 lonely years, he allowed himself to hope for something beyond survival. Let me tell you a little more about the world Charlotte came from, because I think it matters. Growing up, a Whitfield meant growing up inside a beautiful cage. Every dress was chosen for her. Every dinner guest was selected for what he could offer her father's business, not for who he was as a person. She had been taught to pour tea perfectly, to dance perfectly, to smile perfectly on command. And somewhere in all that perfection, nobody had ever once asked her what she actually wanted. Her mother had passed when Charlotte was only 12, and in the years since, her father had poured every ounce of his ambition into building an empire, with Charlotte as its planned crown jewel, meant to be married off to whichever family could expand the Whitfield name the furthest. So when she sat by that small stone fireplace, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, listening to a man talk about pride and ownership and hard-earned dirt, something inside her recognized a kind of freedom she had never once been offered in her entire privileged life. Isn't it strange, friends, how the poorest man in the valley gave the richest woman in the county the first real choice she'd ever had? Now here's where I have to ask you something important, because it matters more than you'd think. If a story like this, about two people risking everything for something real, means anything to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, friends, we are just getting started, and where this story goes next is going to break your heart before it puts it back together, stronger than ever. Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about him. Days passed, and the memory of that small ranch house, that quiet strength, that honest voice by the firelight, followed her through every dinner, every social obligation, every empty conversation inside those grand mansion walls. So before dawn one morning, while the household still slept, she saddled her horse in secret and rode straight back to Silver Creek Ranch. She found Ethan already at work, hammering the last nails into a new stretch of fence. When he saw her riding up, he nearly dropped his tools in surprise, and something like joy he hadn't let himself feel in years. Charlotte dismounted, rolled up her sleeves despite his protests, and insisted on helping. Her soft hands weren't built for hard labor, and she hit her thumb with the hammer within the first 10 minutes, yelping loud enough to send birds scattering from the nearby trees. Ethan laughed, a real, full laugh, for what felt like the first time in far too long. Over the following weeks, Charlotte returned again and again. They painted the ranch house together, splattering white paint on each other until it turned into a playful chase around the yard. They shared simple meals of bread and beans on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed orange and purple across the horizon. Charlotte taught herself to ride bareback under Ethan's patient instruction, laughing freely across the open pasture in a way she never had inside her father's mansion. There was a morning, not long after the paint fight, when a summer storm caught them both out in the open pasture without warning, fat raindrops turning to a downpour in seconds. They ran laughing for the shelter of the barn eave, soaked through, breathless, and stood there close together watching the rain hammer the yard in front of them. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The air between them was thick enough to touch, and for one long moment, Ethan thought about closing that last small distance between them, before Charlotte, quiet and a little sad, reminded him gently that her father would never approve of a man like him. Ethan stepped back, respectful even in his disappointment, and said nothing more about it that day. She also helped him fix the old windmill by the well, holding tools steady while he climbed up to repair the blades. And one afternoon she surprised him with fresh curtains for the kitchen window, sewn herself in secret, along with a chipped glass jar she filled with wildflowers picked from the field between their two properties. Little by little, without either of them quite noticing it happening, that broken-down house was becoming a home. Not because of money, because of her. But it wasn't just laughter. Late one evening, sitting close together on the porch steps, Charlotte finally confided in him about the crushing weight hanging over her future. Her father's plan to marry her off to a wealthy suitor from Houston, a man she'd met only twice and felt absolutely nothing for. Ethan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with a quiet, protective anger he had no right to feel and couldn't help feeling anyway. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, neither of them said the words out loud, but when Charlotte's hand rested inches from his on the wooden step and neither of them pulled away, they both understood exactly what was happening between them. Of course, happiness, this fragile, rarely survives contact with the real world for long. A servant loyal to Mr. Whitfield noticed Charlotte's secret morning rides and reported them straight to her father. Mr. Whitfield, a proud and calculating man who had built his fortune through discipline and control, confronted his daughter the moment she returned home. His fury filled the entire mansion. "You will never set foot on that man's property again," he told her, his voice cold as iron. Charlotte, tears burning in her eyes, refused to promise any such thing. She was locked in her room that very night, and for the first time in her privileged life, Charlotte Whitfield understood what it felt like to be a prisoner inside her own home. Across the valley, Ethan waited. Every evening for a week, he stood at the ranch gate as the sun went down, hoping to see her silhouette on the horizon. Every evening, she didn't come. His work continued, but something had gone quiet in him again. The same heaviness that had followed him for 15 lonely years before she rode into his life. He kept the pressed wildflower she'd once given him folded carefully inside his shirt pocket, and more than once, in the middle of driving a fence post or mending a broken gate hinge, he'd stop, pull it out, and turn it slowly between his fingers, as if the small, fragile thing might somehow tell him whether she was all right. He told himself he had no right to expect anything from a woman like Charlotte Whitfield. He told himself that every single night. He never quite believed it. Then, one evening, a familiar servant slipped through the fence line and pressed a folded letter into his hands before hurrying away without a word. Ethan tore it open right there in the dying light. It was Charlotte's handwriting, desperate, honest, full of love, telling him her father was planning to send her away to Boston to end things between them for good. Ethan didn't hesitate for even a second. He saddled his horse in the dark and rode hard toward the Whitfield estate, his heart pounding louder than the hoofbeats beneath him. He arrived to find armed ranch hands blocking the gate, torches lit against the darkness, and Mr. Whitfield himself stepping out onto the porch with nothing but cold contempt in his eyes for the humble cowboy standing before him. "You have no business here," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice carrying easily across the torchlit yard. "Turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Any other man might have turned that horse around right then. Ethan Reeves did not. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, and walked forward until the ranch hand's rifles were nearly level with his chest, and he looked Charlotte's father dead in the eye. "I own 30 acres of dirt and a barn that still smells like smoke," Ethan said. "I don't have your money, and I never will, but I love your daughter for exactly who she is, not for what her name can buy me. And that's more than most of the men lining up to marry her can honestly say." The yard went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold still, waiting to see what Mr. Whitfield would do next. Upstairs, Charlotte heard his voice through her window and ran. She flew down the grand staircase, past her stunned father, out into the torchlit yard, and threw herself into Ethan's arms in front of the entire household. Mr. Whitfield ordered him off the property, threatening to destroy him financially, but Charlotte stepped between them, declaring, loud enough for every servant and every ranch hand to hear, that she would rather live poor and happy than wealthy and empty for the rest of her life. For one long, tense moment, nobody moved, and then something shifted in Mr. Whitfield's stern expression, a flicker of memory, perhaps, of his own younger years, of a love he himself had once sacrificed for ambition. He said nothing. Charlotte took Ethan's hand, and together they walked out of that mansion and rode into the night without looking back. They returned to Silver Creek Ranch near midnight, exhausted but resolute. Charlotte looked at that small, humble house, cracked walls, mismatched furniture, dust in every corner, and realized with absolute certainty that it felt more like home than the mansion ever had. Word travels fast in small ranching communities, and it wasn't long before neighbors who had heard the whole story began showing up at Silver Creek Ranch, unasked, ready to help. A dozen families arrived one morning with lumber, tools, and willing hands, and by that same afternoon they had rebuilt the barn roof together, hammers rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Children ran between the wagons while their mothers laid out food on long wooden tables, and by sundown, what had once been one lonely man's impossible project had become an entire community's shared achievement. Charlotte moved among them, handing out water, laughing amid the dust and noise, utterly transformed from the sheltered woman she had been just months before. That evening, sitting exhausted at those long tables under a string of hanging lanterns, surrounded by people who had never once asked what her last name was, Charlotte turned to Ethan and told him quietly that she finally understood what he had meant. That very first stormy night, about a broken-down piece of land, meaning more than any mansion ever could. It wasn't the dirt or the barn, or even the ranch itself. It was this: people who showed up for you simply because you'd earned it. But their happiness was tested one final time. Early one morning, storm clouds gathered fast and violent on the horizon. Lightning struck dry grass near the property, and within minutes, fire was racing toward the newly rebuilt barn, where the cattle stood trapped inside. Ethan ran straight into the smoke without a second thought, wrestling open stall gates as Charlotte rallied every neighbor within shouting distance to form a bucket line from the creek. A burning beam collapsed near the entrance, blocking his path, and for one horrifying moment Charlotte screamed his name into the smoke, certain she had lost him. But Ethan found another way out, emerging coughing and soot-covered into the yard, where Charlotte ran to him, checking desperately for injuries, relief and terror colliding across her face. For nearly 2 hours, the fire fought back against every bucket, every shovel of dirt thrown against it, the wind shifting cruelly just when it seemed the worst had passed. Men who had never met Ethan Reeves before that spring worked shoulder to shoulder with him now, faces black with soot, throats raw from smoke, refusing to let the flames take what this community had only just finished rebuilding together. Charlotte never once stopped moving, passing buckets, calling out warnings when the wind shifted, dragging a half-conscious ranch hand clear of a collapsing fence line. Whatever fear lived in her that day, she didn't let it show, not once. By dusk, the fire was finally contained thanks to the combined effort of an entire community that had come to love this humble cowboy and the woman who had chosen him. And then, unexpectedly, a familiar carriage arrived at the smoke-filled ranch. Mr. Whitfield had heard about the fire and rushed to check on his daughter, fear breaking through his usual stern composure for the first time anyone could remember. He found Charlotte safe in Ethan's arms, covered in soot but very much alive. And as Mr. Whitfield walked slowly through the wreckage, he noticed something that struck him harder than any argument ever could. Dozens of neighbors, exhausted and soot-covered, who had stayed all night to help a man they barely knew simply because of the honest character he had shown them. For the first time, Mr. Whitfield approached Ethan without contempt. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it firmly, exhaustion and quiet dignity written across his soot-streaked face. And from that moment on, everything began to change. Mr. Whitfield ordered his own ranch hands to bring lumber and supplies to help rebuild what the fire had damaged. He and Ethan worked side by side, raising new barn beams, an unlikely partnership neither of them could have imagined just weeks before. Months passed. Silver Creek Ranch transformed from a broken, forgotten piece of land into a thriving home, full pastures, healthy cattle, fresh paint on every wall. And one golden evening, in the doorway of the very barn that fire had once nearly destroyed, Ethan Reeves knelt before Charlotte Whitfield with a small, simple ring in his weathered hand. She said yes before he even finished asking. Their wedding took place right there on Silver Creek Ranch, under a sky full of string lanterns, surrounded by the very community that had helped rebuild their lives from ashes. Charlotte wore a simple dress, nothing like the extravagant gowns her father once imagined for her, with wildflowers woven through her red hair instead of jewels. Mr. Whitfield walked his daughter down the grass aisle himself, pride and tears mixing openly on his once unreadable face, a man transformed as thoroughly as the ranch itself had been. And when Ethan and Charlotte shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the entire gathered crowd erupted into joyful applause, loud enough to carry across the whole valley. That night, they danced together under the lanterns until the fire in the rebuilt barn burned low, foreheads touching, utterly unaware of anyone else still standing in that yard. Somewhere above them, fireworks someone had arranged, as a surprise, burst softly against the night sky, and for just a moment, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath in celebration alongside them. A year later, Silver Creek Ranch looked nothing like the ruin Ethan had first ridden up to on that tired brown horse. The barn stood strong, the pastures stretched green and full of healthy cattle. And on the porch, in the soft light of early evening, Charlotte, now expecting their first child, tended a small vegetable garden, while Ethan taught a young ranch hand how to properly mend a fence, quietly passing along everything he had once had to learn completely alone. Mr. Whitfield visited often now, sitting comfortably with his daughter and son-in-law, sharing coffee like old friends rather than former adversaries. He had even started, quietly and without announcement, sending some of his own hands over to help during the busiest weeks of the season, never once mentioning it, never once expecting thanks. Pride, it turns out, can soften slowly, even in a man who once believed it was the only thing worth protecting. And every so often, Ethan would find himself standing at that same fence line where it all began, the exact spot where a broken gate had once hung crooked on rusted hinges, looking out over everything he had built from absolutely nothing. The barn stood tall behind him. Cattle grazed peacefully across pastures that had once been nothing but dry, forgotten dirt. And somewhere behind him, he could hear Charlotte's laughter carrying across the yard, mixed with the first small sounds of a child who would grow up never knowing a single day of the loneliness he once knew. Standing there, in the golden light of another Texas evening, Ethan Reeves felt something he never thought he'd feel again after all those lonely years. Peace. So, friends, let me ask you honestly, what would you have done standing in Ethan Reeves's boots that first morning, staring at a broken-down ranch nobody else wanted? Would you have seen ruin, or would you have seen possibility? And what would you have done in Charlotte's position, raised inside walls of gold, given the choice between comfort and something real? If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while I was putting it together, please take just 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which part hit you hardest. The fire, the wedding, or that very first moment in the tall grass when two completely different worlds collided for good. Thank you for staying with me until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.